Hello, everyone. David here. I originally released this testimonial as the third testimonial in this project, The Great Unknown, and I stand by everything in it. But since then, I did want to add a couple thoughts onto the end of it. So I humbly ask you to watch the original testimonial here, and then at the end, I'm going to be adding on a couple more thoughts that I've had since then. Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is David, and in this video I'm going to be talking all about drugs. When I say drugs, for the purposes of this video, I'm referring to any mood or mind-altering substances, legal and illegal. I want to start out by saying that because this is a very complicated and controversial topic, this video is not intended to be a deep dive or to answer all the questions, and there are many points that you may disagree with or that might make you uncomfortable. I ask for your grace and for you to listen with an open heart to my experience with substances and what I've learned through my master's studies to become a clinical counselor. That combined with my experiences has shaped the information that I'll be sharing today. And also I want to say if there's anything that anyone wants to add or has concerns about, to please email me at hiswitnessmusic@gmail.com. And we can message privately or perhaps even have a discussion on my podcast, Fundamental Questions of Being. I'll be giving a little bit of history in the US with mind-altering substances and even back further than that, just a broad overarching history, again, not in depth. I'll be giving a little bit of a biblical perspective since many of the followers of this page profess to be Christian, and talking about things like trauma and the effects that that has on the brain, and sharing my own personal experiences and where I stand today with the drug war that's been waging in the US for the last 50 years. I want to start out by talking about a little bit of a biblical perspective going all the way back to a perfect world. Before there was any sin or pain or evil, when our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma and grandpa Adam and Eve were in the garden and there was no sin and God said that everything was perfect and orderly and in its place, I've wondered recently if they would ever have wanted to use mind-altering substances had there never been a fall into sin. My inclination, or what I'm leaning more towards, is saying that they probably wouldn't, and in fact they probably would have hated the effects that substances would have on their brains, because they did have perfect consciousness and no pain and no guilt or insecurity. I could be wrong on that, but I just want to start from that fundamental place of saying that I don't believe that a healthy, perfect person would necessarily need or even want mind or mood-altering substances of any kind. But the hard truth is that there is evil in this world, and there is pain in this world. And one thing that I've learned from studying trauma is when people experience trauma in their lives, that it can actually change the chemistry in your brain. And that's why some psychiatrists will prescribe medications that work to kind of set that balance back and reset someone's equilibrium. And so it's always a fine line of in counseling we try to reinforce things like perseverance and positive coping mechanisms and battling through tough times, but there are times, and I personally will say that I'm very much in the camp of trying to prescribe as few medications as possible for the shortest amount of time possible, with the hopes of trying to get off of them. But that being said, because of the world we live in, there are situations where it's necessary. One of the things that's interesting too that I want to talk about before going into some of the scriptural foundations for my message here today is how it's when someone becomes heavily addicted to mind-altering substances, whether that's legal or illegal, what they prescribe is going through 12-step programs often, or counseling, basically talking to others about your feelings and building community and networking with others, and not relying on yourself to get those emotions out, or whatever struggles are maybe causing one to lean on a crutch of a substance. So I think that should always be in the back of our minds when we're talking about treating anything, is the end road, treating anything with medications, I want to say. I've seen studies that show that children who are prescribed any type of mood or mind-altering substances in their youth, that's a big indicator that they could struggle with addictions later on in life. So a focus should always be on trying to work behaviorally and connecting people back in with community and helping them express and cope in positive ways. But again, that being said, there are situations because of trauma and because of sin in the world where medications are necessary. So going back all the way to the fall into sin, in Genesis 3, verse 6, when Eve first takes a bite of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it says that her eyes were opened. And we'll go back to that imagery of the eyes later, but to me, I think about this as the first time that people relied on something other than God to bring them, to help them find something that they were seeking, to fill a hole that they were feeling in their hearts. Eve thought that she could gain wisdom and be like God, or that God was holding out on her or had nefarious intent, and so she went behind her father's back and used a substance that he had told her not to use. I'll come back to that later again, but it says that their eyes were opened, and now they saw their nakedness and felt sin and insecurity and guilt and shame, and they hid. In the Bible, there's several passages that are very clear about about using in moderation. One of the passages that I really like says, "Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with hymns, psalms, and songs from the Spirit." And there are other passages which reference not getting drunk or out of control while using alcohol, to use it in moderation, and that is God-pleasing. And in fact, I want to draw your attention to Jesus' first miracle. I found this very interesting lately, that whatever miracle Jesus chose for his first miracle was going to get some attention because it was the first one. And he used his first miracle to turn water into alcohol at a party with his friends after they had run out. And I think, there's not mention of other substances in the Bible. And what's really interesting about alcohol is it's the only substance that's proven to have a direct link to increases in aggression. That's very interesting to me. It has the most potential, I think, to put you out of control of your faculties and can do the most damage to your internal organs. I think possibly the reason that alcohol is the only substance mentioned in the Bible specifically is that it can do the most damage. It's perhaps the most risky. So to me, Jesus using his first miracle to turn water into alcohol at a party with his friends says, even this I will allow in moderation. Even this substance, this potentially very dangerous substance, can be used God-pleasingly and is, and in fact, even a part of our sacrament for Holy Communion, the sacrament in the Christian Church. So I want to be hesitant in there and saying I don't think that God is telling us outside of communion that we should be drinking alcohol, but Jesus makes it pretty clear with this first miracle that he condones it in moderation. One point I was thinking about recently was why at parties often adults will feel a need to involve mind-altering substances in the party to elevate the party. And I was thinking about how that's likely because people are using this substance to cover up a level of pain or to temporarily mask that, and that allows for them to escape the troubles that they might be feeling in their real life and to just enjoy their time with their family and friends and have that party, that social gathering time together. Some people might say, oh, it's just to have fun. Well, I would argue that the reason it's to have fun is to help mask some of the pain of everyday life. I think of trauma as kind of being on a spectrum, and everybody goes and experiences different levels of trauma at different points in their lives, and we're all carrying baggage with us every single day from day to day, some more than others. So more than anything, we need to lead with love and show grace, the same grace that's been given to us. Going back to the fall, I want to say that I think part of that is due to God showing us grace in this life because he knows we have to live in this evil world. He provided soothing ointments and lotions and substances to ease our pain. I want to read to you from Genesis chapter 8 now, and this is about chapter 9, and I'll be starting at verse 18. This is an account called the Sons of Noah. This takes place after the flood, and so Noah and his family are now in the new world as they're the only surviving family. It says, "The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the 3 sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk, and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers.' He also said, 'Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth.' And it says, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years, lived a total of 950 years, and then he died." So what Ham did is he gossiped about his father in his father's most vulnerable state, when he was drunk and naked. And while Shem and Japheth came and covered their father up without even looking at him, Ham decided to expose him and draw attention to his vulnerable state. And I find that account interesting. First of all, I think if ever there was a time when someone would get a pass for getting drunk, I think Noah maybe deserves it for being the first father into the new world after the whole rest of the world is now dead. It's a new beginning, sure, but it was also probably a pretty traumatic experience for him and his family to go through. And so he drank some wine after the flood, after they're in the new world, and he had too much to drink. Now, God's word does say that is a sin, and so I'm clearly saying that I'm not condoning that behavior. However, the major point of this account seems to be more on the reaction of Noah's family and praising those who lifted him up and covered him and supported him in his vulnerable state, versus Ham, who gossiped about him in his vulnerable state. I think that's an important thing for us to remember as we're working with any family or friends or any of our brothers or sisters, to show grace and kindness and to try and protect each other's pride as much as possible. I'm going to segue now into giving a little bit of history in the U.S. Again, this is going to be a very, very overarching history. I'm going to show you a couple graphs along the way. But again, this is just to give you a little bit of a flavor of sort of the road that's been traveled here in the last 50 to 70 years in our country. There was, prior to the 1900s, there wasn't much regulation. And going back to when the government tried to cut off the supply, or during Prohibition for alcohol, is what I'm trying to say here. As soon as alcohol was made illegal in this country, the mafia, underground crime units instantly had planned how to keep that supply moving. Because the hard truth is that you can't cut off the supply of mind-altering substances. When they tried to do it with alcohol, it failed miserably. And now today, alcohol is legal again. What else is legal is nicotine and cigarettes, and those are arguably the most addictive substance out there. So we've got the most harmful substance and the most addictive substance legal right now today. It wasn't until in the 1970s that there was a push to make certain substances illegal and keep some legal. One of the very interesting things to look at that time was the 100-to-1 discrepancy. And what that's referring to is there were laws that would give punishments that were 100 times worse for people using crack cocaine than for people who were using regular cocaine. Chemically, they're identical. There's no difference between them, and this makes really no sense. But at the time, it was believed that more affluent white people were using cocaine, and crack was used primarily with minorities in black neighborhoods. So there is some controversy or disagreement over some of the motivations that were underlying those initial drug laws and the schedule that was brought about during the Nixon administration. But no matter what the motivations were, even if it was people truly trying to help other people, that doesn't change the fact that this drug war has failed miserably over the last 50 years. So one graph I'll show you shows the rise in overdoses from heroin, deaths from heroin overdose, which is, as you can see, a dramatic rise over the last 20 or 30 years. And then another graph here shows the incarceration rates in the U.S. And this going back to since about when these drug laws were made. And as you can see, there's about a 700% increase over that time. We incarcerate more people per capita in the U.S. than any other country in the world. We've got a major problem here that stems from these laws. People being ripped away from their families. About 85 to 92% of everyone in our jails and prisons here is there for some type of drug or alcohol related offense, whether it's trying to obtain illegal drugs or while under the influence of them or whatever it might be. So the main focus has been to punish rather than to heal. And we have no real progress to show for this. Addiction rates have been climbing. The overdoses have been climbing. Incarceration rates have been climbing. There's been really no positive to speak of. And we've spent trillions of dollars on this drug war. And I would argue it's actually, from what I've just mentioned, it's making things much, much worse. I want to talk about there's been countries like Switzerland and Portugal and Germany and others, England even, I believe, have tried a different approach where they've decriminalized drugs, made them legal. And that sounds probably pretty crazy to a lot of people and pretty scary to a lot of people. But the one thing that I want to say is they're finding that it's having a good effect, that addiction rates are going down, that sometimes there's an initial spike in people using, although it's usually not the populations that some would think, not kids as most people are afraid of, but older people in their 30s and 40s who are maybe using marijuana or another substance for the first time rather than alcohol because they have the option. Many people who use illegal substances, it's estimated between 80 to 90%, don't have addictions to them and can use in moderation. That's also another controversial stat, but I encourage you to dig into this and find out for yourself. it's a very interesting rabbit hole to go down. The more I've gone down, the more I've seen that trying to cut off the supply is pretty foolish. It will never ever happen. And also that people need to want to get better for themselves. So in these other countries where they've made drugs legal, they've focused more of their resources on treatment and ad campaigns to educate. Now, in these places, it has not eliminated the need to use law enforcement and to still impose penalties for certain people who maybe are refusing to get any help, or are still involved in heavy criminal activity. But it's brought that need way down and incarceration rates way down as people have more alternatives. We have versions of this in the US with things like drug court, where people can go through certain steps like treatment and have charges expunged off of their record. More of that line of thinking is what we need, a line of thinking that looks to not punish certain substance use over other substance use, to say it's okay to use the most harmful substance, but not okay to use others. The other benefit of making all drugs legal is it cuts off the black market, or greatly minimizes the black market and funding terrorist groups and cartels. They all are able to thrive when they have a ginormous black market with mind-altering substances. They've created safe spaces where people can go and use certain substances with health professionals on hand, and can even go and get prescriptions for things like heroin. In this country, we like to call heroin other things like OxyContin or other drugs. It's interesting about OxyContin, when they first were rolling that out, pharmaceutical companies, it was labeled as being non-addictive, which is ridiculous. Any substance, or really any behavior that brings a desired outcome, can be addictive. But certainly, many people who overdose on opioids, it's from synthetic opioids. It's not always just heroin. One of the other benefits to making substances legal is you remove the forbidden fruit nature of the substance. The very fact that certain things are illegal makes people drawn to them even more. Prohibition of alcohol is an example of this. If you were to make cigarettes illegal, I'm sure you'd see some similar behaviors as to what you see with people chasing other illegal substances. Something that's been interesting, it seems like there's been a shift in our country over the last several years, with marijuana becoming legal in many states and the benefits of medicinal uses of it being seen. Earlier this year, even psychedelics like psilocybin were made legal in Oregon and I believe California as well, as they're finding that using microdosing and sometimes even a single psychedelic experience is removing fear of death for people with terminal illnesses like cancer, or treating PTSD, or addictions. There have been several studies which have shown that a single psilocybin trip can cure alcoholism, essentially, for people. And there are other benefits listed. And so now I'm going to segue a little bit into my experience with mind-altering substances. And there's kind of two tales that I will tell you here. My experience with addiction, and then my experience with the positive components of substances. So as I talk about in my story, which I released before this video, tied to my song, The Great Unknown, is I talked about how most of my life I've struggled with panic attacks, and those were very specific to when I would try to conceptualize eternity after a traumatic event that happened to me in my childhood. I would experience very traumatic panic attacks as well, that were deep existential attacks that I felt the essence of my being threatened. essentially. And when I would have these panic attacks, they'd last about 10 minutes, and it would feel like I was falling into a black abyss that was never ending, and I'd just want to run as far and fast as I could. And I'd be crying and screaming to my parents. And these continued on and became more and more vivid the older that I got, and were very terrifying. So the first time that I really used a mind-altering substance was when I tried marijuana when I was 18 years old. I had tried alcohol once before that when I was 17, but I've never been drawn to alcohol at all because the first couple experiences that I had on it, I didn't like how out of control it made me, and I blacked out and threw up, and I probably drank like a stupid high school kid, but I had no desire to use alcohol from that point on. With marijuana, when I tried that when I was 18, I fell in love with it instantly. It was like I had found a new best friend, because it was the first thing that I had experienced that for a moment took away all of that panic and all of that fear and just kind of masked it and dumbed me down to like one thought where I just didn't think about it anymore. And so I found great peace in that, as I had been struggling with it for about 15 years before that. No, I'm sorry, more like about 10 years or so. That was when I was about 18. Over the next couple years, I tried other substances when I went to college. Again, this is not going to be an educational, in-depth look at all substances and the effects that they have, uppers and downers, amphetamines, psychedelics, and cannabinoids, opioids. I encourage you to study those effects on your own. I will be talking about a couple that I've tried, and so primarily that was marijuana, and later on in life I did try psychedelics. My first experience with psychedelics was when I was 19 also, and I tried mushrooms or psilocybin, and I did it at a party with friends, and I had a pretty bad experience because I was fighting it the whole time. One of the things that's interesting about psychedelics, and so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, is there's a long history with psychedelics being the focus of religious practices and rituals throughout various different churches throughout history. The imagery of the eye that I brought up from Genesis 3 verse 6, where it says their eyes were opened, the imagery of eyes is very prevalent throughout the Bible. Look in Ezekiel when he has a vision and sees eyes all over spinning wheels in the sky, and in Revelation there are several references to eyes, creatures encircling the throne that are full of eyes. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there's the third eye, which represents expanding consciousness, and Egyptians had the Eye of Horus. And I'll show you a depiction of that here. It's a section of the brain cut open, and see the corpus callosum there, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, but all this imagery with the eye, it's called our pineal gland in our brain, which is right inside your forehead and inside there, and it's not very big, but what they found is that they believe that DMT, dimethyltryptamine, I think is what it's called, I could be wrong there, is secreted from this gland. DMT is a psychedelic. Some might argue that it's like the top psychedelic. It's found in all living things. Some believe that it's secreted at birth and at death, although there's some debate over that. So getting back to this imagery of the eye, my first experience on psilocybin, one of the things that I do remember from that bad trip was I had a hallucination of eyes all over the room, and they were like blinking at me. It was like hundreds of eyes, and I remember that very vividly. And later on in life, as I studied these other cultures and the symbolism of eyes in the Bible, it reminded me of that. Now when I think about the imagery of the eye, I think about understanding or consciousness. And so it seems to me that these other cultures throughout history that were also using these substances could possibly have had those similar experiences while under these. They describe them as mystical experiences that are deeply spiritual. And in several places, even in the US, you can use psychedelics for the purposes of religious practices. After that experience with the bad trip and fighting it, I really didn't want anything else to do with psychedelics at that time. It was kind of a traumatic experience, to be honest. I've since learned that a big reason for that is they talk about when people are using psychedelics, one of the most important things is set and setting, because psychedelics enhance everything in your brain. What's interesting about psychedelics versus other drugs is that when they've done brain scans on people who are using, say, cocaine or marijuana or heroin, it lights up a section of their brain. But with psychedelics, a person's whole brain is lit up like a Christmas tree, and it's all interacting and connecting with itself in a way that's different than other forms of consciousness. Also, psychedelics I would consider to be kind of like the top of the drug food chain. People use substances to escape some type of pain, and psychedelics create kind of the most dramatic escape to where even your very reality can feel like it's being affected. Hallucinations, auditory and visual hallucinations. But so throughout history, the psychedelics have been used to treat or as the focus of spiritual practices. And more recently, again, as I said, there's research that has shown the powerful effects of using psychedelics to treat PTSD, terminal illness, fear of death, and addictions, among other things. So that kind of contrast of them being the most extreme in some senses, but also having a healing and spiritual component is quite interesting to me. Later on in life, I was introduced to LSD, and I only had a couple experiences on LSD. And I'll be sharing the first and last experience that I had. I'll be sharing the first today, but because of the nature of the last experience that I ever had on psychedelics, I am choosing to hold off on that for now, and I'll be sharing that in the future. My first experience that I had came at a very dark time in my life, and I really wasn't feeling too much hope for anything, and honestly, there were two reasons that I used it, and one was because I had learned about some of the positive effects that were happening in our world today from the uses of microdosing psychedelics, and the other was because I was truly at my wit's end. So I did use it as a form of escape. And I'm not trying to glorify this experience, but I just want to be real in saying that that first experience that I ever had under the influence of LSD was one of the most profoundly positive experiences of my life. The same frequency or wavelength inside of me that was tapped into, that sort of eternal wavelength that was tapped into when I would have these panic attacks where it was feeling like I was falling into that black, dark abyss. This seemed to tap into that same wavelength inside of me, only now, instead of a dark abyss, it was like a colorful spectrum of color and a feeling of great peace and love. And so I want to be careful in saying this, but it is the truth that since that experience, I've not had any panic attacks or even come close to having any panic attacks. It feels to me like they were cured from that experience. I want to show you a picture of what's come to be called or known as the flower of life. It's also on my shirt here, but basically this is what people are referring to when they talk about the flower of life. And the reason I bring this up is this is a visual hallucination that I had while I was under the influence of this LSD, was this flower of life. And what it represents is creation, as I'm showing you here. and connectedness, that we're all connected to the one who created all things. Other people have reported seeing this while under the influence, and so that became very interesting to me, this idea of connectedness coming about through this experience. I felt a great connection spiritually and mentally, and so I wanted to share this experience with others, and I did that. And what I found is that people who had not also used psychedelics were quite afraid of what I was saying, and even worried that they had changed me and done damage to me. So one thing I want to say to that is, if someone gets drunk the next day, we don't usually judge them as being tainted or different or broken. The effects of the drug have worn off and they're back to themselves again. That was the case for me under this substance and any substances that I've tried. While under the influence, there were effects that made my behavior different, but when those effects wore off, it was back to me again. So please remember that if you're talking to anyone who's used a substance that's maybe unknown to you at this time. Now, on the flip side, I want to talk about how I was when I was actively addicted. I was really insecure at first about my drug addiction, not the least of which is because it was illegal. And Bible passages that there's a not so hidden pearl of great wisdom in are the ones that talk about obeying the governing authority, because when you obey the governing authority, you're not as subject to the governing authority. And so if the government says that something is illegal, then God says you should listen to the government. And so I did sin by breaking the law and using substances, and that played into my guilt and into my insecurity and wanting to hide. And I don't excuse that. When I was in the worst days of my addiction back then, I would lie to people, family and friends. I would steal from people, family and friends, on more than one occasion. And to all those people, I'm deeply sorry. You didn't deserve that, and I'm sorry that you saw that side of me. I want to say thank you to all those who've supported me through those tough times and shown love. To me, that's what really pulls people out of addictions, is that unconditional love and seeing the plank in your own eye before pointing out the splinter in someone else's eye. It would be nice if we never had to rely on a crutch. If you break your leg, it'd be nice if you didn't need to use a crutch or pain medicine for a while, but you've broken your leg, so it's probably a good idea to use that crutch for a while. It's serving its purpose. But it would be a little bit silly if after your leg healed, you kept on using the crutch. So I want to use that analogy for mental health and people who find themselves addicted to a substance. God created all substances for our benefit. There's nothing that God created for us that he made to harm us. And so there's a good use for any and all mood and mind-altering substances. But we need to be careful not to become dependent on that, because the other thing that I learned, there's never enough. And so that's why you have to be careful. That's why God says in his word to only use substances in moderation, because you can fall into that trap of replacing God, essentially, and the peace that only he can provide with a substance that he created, which can only take you so far and then ultimately leave you wanting more and more and more. So what I learned at the end of my journey is we can only find full fulfillment, true fulfillment, through our Creator, through Christ Jesus and through Yahweh, God. I want to read a couple passages to that point. The first one is from John 6, verse 35, and Jesus says here, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." In John 14, verse 6, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." We can't get to heaven through a substance. We can't find lasting peace through a substance. We can only find that lasting peace through God, through Jesus Christ, who won our salvation and conquered death and evil and gave us a way out. So, my prayer for each of you is that you would show each other love and grace. I know there's a lot of people who've been very deeply affected by addictions themselves, or loved ones who've suffered from addictions. There are a lot of people in our country throughout our history that have struggled with addictions, but there are also a lot of people who have struggled with the flip side of it, with people pushing down and judging others and projecting their own insecurities onto others. In the story of the prodigal son, we hear about the son who ran off with wild living and trying to find fulfillment away from his father. And when he came back, we hear about his father welcoming him back with open arms while he's still a long way off. And then we also hear about his brother, who didn't want to show grace and love, who wanted to condemn his brother and keep division and push him away. But that's not what God's word tells us. He tells us to draw each other in and to show love to each other when we're suffering. And rather than to try and punish or divide or isolate, we should draw each other in even more in those times and show love even more when people are suffering. So my heart is with any of you that may have lost a loved one or may have experienced tragedy in your life due to the use or abuse of mind-altering substances. My main message here today is to say I think that we can do better in helping each other out. As a society, I think we can do better with the way we're fighting the drug epidemic. I think it's time to revisit our laws and the way we approach the whole issue when it comes to mind-altering substances. I think we need to come from a place of grace and love and that seeks to heal and build community and families up rather than divide and lock people away without a key. So I pray that this has done something for any of you, the very least of which maybe shed some light onto some of my experiences that I've had with substances. I also pray that if you're out there and you're struggling and you're feeling out of control and that you can't manage your life, reach out to those around you and lay your cares at the feet of Jesus at the cross, who has forgiven all your sin and who alone can give you peace which surpasses all understanding. Find your hope and your comfort in him, the bread of life, the way, the truth, and the life. He loves you unconditionally and is waiting with open arms to pull you in and build you up and make you the person that he wants you to be. God be with all of you. I love you all as my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I pray that you and your families have a wonderful holiday celebration this season. Take care. All right. Thanks again for watching this testimonial. A couple of the thoughts that I wanted to add on since I first released this are, first of all, I don't necessarily see substance abuse disorder or addiction as its own disorder. I see it more as a symptom of unprocessed trauma or negative emotion. Medicine can be useful, but the main emphasis should always be on building community and processing feelings and trauma. I've experienced within my own life and seen in several other people's lives that even if you stop using substances or chemicals, you can still be what's considered a dry drunk or a dry drug user, meaning that you're not using substances or leaning on them, but you are still feeling depression or the symptoms of that underlying unprocessed trauma or negative emotion. So unless you include that in your recovery program, ultimately you'll feel unfulfilled, and it may even lead you back into using down the road, or again, just not feeling completely free from that hole, that God-shaped hole in your heart. The other thing that I want to say is, you know, several countries have designated spaces with medical professionals on hand where people can use illicit substances, at least what are considered illicit substances in the US, safely. We do a similar thing in the US for the most harmful drug, in my opinion, alcohol, and they're called bars, where people can go and use together in a place that is, you know, safe, doesn't necessarily have medical professionals on hand, but people gather together to use a drug there. Also, we condemn those who self-medicate with meth, yet pump it into our children in the form of pharmaceuticals like Adderall and Concerta. The same can be said with heroin. We use OxyContin and oxycodone pharmaceuticals. For alcohol, benzodiazepines, and countless other medicines. Then when those same children or adults grow up with chemical dependency, we often label them as criminals and lock them away. This is a contradiction that needs to be addressed in our society. And I guess the main point there is no matter if someone is self-medicating with the raw chemicals that are found in the streets right now and being pushed by the black markets because they are considered illicit substances, or whether someone is using or even abusing pharmaceuticals, which are basically legal drug dealers, we need to show compassion for them and try and offer support and love and give them resources to help process whatever underlying negative emotion or trauma they might be using those substances for. Unity and community is what it's all about. You know, it's hugs over drugs. People often turn to self-medicating or using legal pharmaceuticals because they're feeling a lack of community or haven't had that chance to process their feelings and any past trauma that they might be experiencing. I want to talk about nature versus nurture real quick. One of the things that I've learned as I've moved along in my journey as a mental health professional is that sometimes, you know, trauma can affect and change your brain chemistry, as I mentioned in this original testimonial. So someone might inherit that from their parents if they had trauma that affected their brain chemistry. And also on top of that, you kind of get a 1-2 punch sometimes if one's parents haven't modeled positive coping mechanisms. So not only do you get kind of the starting behind the 8 ball as far as nature, but also sometimes combined with that, the nurture that comes along with that. So learning to self-medicate and to not process those feelings. So that's what it's all about, is modeling resilience for our children and positive coping mechanisms, keeping things in our routine that address our mind, body, and spirit. Regular outlets in our routines. It's about building healthy habits. One of the analogies that I often use with my clients in crisis is that of piggy banks. So it's good to imagine ourselves as piggy banks, and every day we take in new deposits. Sometimes those are positive deposits, and those are great. Those fill up our banks with good things, and those are the joys of life that keep us moving and keep us motivated. But every day we definitely take in negative deposits into our piggy bank. And that could be past childhood trauma or current trauma that we're going through, or any negative emotions or bad interactions we've had with family or friends, or maybe some bad news that we've had. And, you know, if you only have a couple negative deposits in your bank, you can still shake it around and feel like the right thing to do is just to keep moving on, and you don't feel too depressed or weighed down by it. But we only have so much capacity or room in our bank. And if we don't ever take time to process that negative emotion and trauma, before we know it, our bank is filled up to the top. And it's at that point when people do feel weighed down and depressed and overwhelmed, like they're drowning in negative emotion. And it's like any new thing, we don't have room for it. And that's when people start doing things they wouldn't normally do, like self-medicating or self-harming, or saying they don't even want to live anymore. So the beauty of counseling is, and it doesn't have to be a counselor, anyone that you can trust that's not going to try to push advice on you, but just basically allow you a safe place to be raw and talk about your feelings. The beauty with counseling is that we're bound by confidentiality, so we're not going to go blabbing your secrets, and also we are trained how to empathically receive those feelings without giving advice, just helping people process through those. And I think of it as like if you're sick with the flu and your stomach feels all gross, but then you puke, you vomit, and you get all that toxic stuff out, and you often feel better right after that. And so it's the same thing with our mental health. Is our piggy banks are in our minds, and when they're filled up to the top and we talk about them, those feelings, they come out of the darkness of our mind, out of our piggy bank and into the light, and that's when they start to die and lose their power over us. So you get all that toxic stuff out and you start to feel better. It seems counterintuitive and silly, but that's truly what's worked for me and what I've seen work for other people as well. So keeping that routine in your life of regularly processing through any negative emotion or trauma with either a loved one that you can trust or with a licensed counselor. I want to give just a real direct warning. I talked about psychedelic use in this testimonial and how it did have a positive effect for me because of a panic disorder that I had suffered for about 30 years of my life. I do not recommend just using psychedelics in any setting. I think it should be in a controlled setting, and it is definitely not for everyone. Specifically, people who are have any type of schizophrenic symptoms. I guess what I'm saying there is I'm not recommending it for everyone. There has been a lot of great research that's come out of Johns Hopkins University, which has shown the benefits that psychedelics can have for people struggling with alcoholism or addictions, people with terminal illnesses, fear of death, PTSD, among other things. But it is not for everyone. And one of the things that I'll say from my experiences with them is it's not exactly a pleasant experience. One of the things that people talk about is it causes ego death. So you kind of go through sort of a crucifixion phase while you're in it, and they can last 8 to 12 hours. But sometimes then it can lead to, I've heard the analogy of it's like shaking up a snow globe, and then when things resettle in your brain, it just allows for some clarity. But again, I would not recommend it for everyone. And in some cases, it can actually lead to greater disorder, especially, again, for those struggling with any types of schizophrenic symptoms. And sometimes for people who have that dormant inside of them, it can lead to schizophrenic breaks. So I would recommend only doing this in a controlled setting. In the state where I live currently, Wisconsin, there are some psychedelic therapies available legally. The main one right now that I know of is ketamine therapy. And it seems as though, like in other states, it's becoming more and more prevalent. But I would recommend only doing that in a controlled setting and not just going and using it like a party drug or doing it out on the street. It can lead to a bad trip and maybe lifelong disorder. So very firm warning that I want to give there. When I think about substance use, lately I've been thinking about it as like baby binkies or baby bottles. I prefer binkies instead because it's something that we use to pacify ourselves and to feel some type of stability, like a child does with their binky. Makes them feel a sense of safety. And I feel like they're provided by Mother Earth, that God gave us substances to cure or to help ease our pain as we're going through this very dark world. But ultimately, if we keep on relying on those, we will feel unfulfilled. Our moms always make us feel safe and like we're accepted just the way we are. And our dads, are often there to, and I'm generalizing here, I'm not trying to stereotype, but generally dads are there to say, yes, you're accepted the way you are, but you could be more. And tying that in with the Mother Earth and Heavenly Father analogy is, yes, we are provided these substances during this life to help ease some of the pain and negative emotion and trauma that we experience as a result of sin in this life. But ultimately, it is only our Heavenly Father who can fill that God-shaped hole in our hearts. So for a time, medications can be useful and in several cases may be necessary for life. But as I said in this testimonial originally, I think the main goal should always be to try and use them for the shortest amount of time as possible in each individual case, and with the goal of trying to wean our way off of them. I don't think it's a great strategy long-term to rely on anything outside of ourselves or outside of God to give us long-term peace, because ultimately we'll just want more and more and more. I've heard the term, one is too much and 1,000 never enough. So I think that the other thing to remember that I started to address in this original testimonial is that the end road for people struggling with chemical dependency, if you are only using a medication or a drug to try and treat that negative emotion and trauma, instead of incorporating also counseling and processing feelings and trauma, you're going to find that the end road to that addiction or that chemical dependency is ultimately to meet up with AA or NA groups and talk about feelings and to process through that trauma. So it's better to do it right away, even if you're using medication or drugs to cope as part of your treatment plan. If you don't include a comprehensive, holistic approach of including that counseling and building community and unity, which is really what it's all about. Medications are like a tool to help you get there, but ultimately the end road is to face the dragon. That's another expression I like, because it's better to confront the dragon in its lair than to wait for it to come to you. Meaning, we all have a dragon in our lives when it comes to mental health struggles and trauma and negative emotion, and we can pretend that it's not there. But the hard truth is that it is there, and it'll just keep growing stronger and stronger and attack us at a time when it's not real convenient or when we wouldn't like it. So you kind of get to pick your pain, and you can, the better choice, in my opinion, is to be that knight in shining armor and say, no, I'm going to do this on my terms and take control of this and lean on the support around me, and I'm going to go and confront that dragon, that beast in its lair. And so anyway, just wanted to add those thoughts to this testimonial. I welcome anyone to share any additional thoughts or concerns with me, again, at hiswitnessmusic@gmail.com, and we can talk there privately, or perhaps share a public podcast where others could benefit from our discussion. So thank you all again for listening. God be with you.